The United Nations General Assembly is all set to be held in the New York City for the 76th time this evening. 2021 has already been a very challenging year thanks to last year's all the concerning COVID pandemic continuing its presence into this year as well, but we have also seen certain geopolitical pressures happening all over the world. Especially if you have seen the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, this also has paved a way for a lot of criticism, lot of debate on geopolitical pressures in the global arena. This, along with many other issues, will be at the center table in the General Assembly discussion happening in the New York City this evening. What would be the most interesting topics, most talked about debates happening in the United Nations this year? Number 1. The geopolitical pressures. Of course, just as we have pointed out, the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan has been heavily criticized in the global arena. But not only this, there have been various incidents where United States, the Western Front, and even the China and the Eastern Front is getting involved in and warming up in order to create a global scale debate. In addition to the Afghan issue, the never so resolving North Korean issue, the Iranian nuclear deal issue, and also the Chinese geopolitical pressure, and especially their debt trap diplomacy, these issues are on table. But surprisingly, there's an issue, there's a bit of a dilemma in between certain friendly nations: the US, UK, Australia, and France. The United States, United Kingdom, and Australia signed in a deal a pact to supply Australia with nuclear-powered submarines which would enable them to patrol the Pacific. This undercuts the previous deal with France, and France is of course furious, and what they have done is, surprisingly, they called back their ambassador from United States and also from Australia last Friday, a move you would not expect from an ally. Of course, the Chinese have also been opposing in terms of this particular issue. This would definitely be in the limelight at the session today. In terms of the Iranian nuclear issue, the newly appointed president of Iran would be missing the General Assembly this year. Now, this is all because of the COVID pandemic is growing as a concern in their country, and it has been spreading, transmitting at a rapid rate in Iran. However, he would be sending a recorded clip to be played at the General Assembly, and most of the Western nations and opposing nations would be paying attention to this. It is important to know what would be the Iran's stance on this, and also the Western Front's stance on the Iranian nuclear deal. So this is another thing to be focused on. The good old friend North Korea would not be stronger enough to threaten United States or the allies this year. The problem is they have a significant issue of a famine going on in the country, and North Korea has turned to China for help. Now, this also paves the way for China to come into the limelight as a global superpower, or to come in assistance of its friends, creating or furthermore strengthening their alliance in the China-friendly front. Now, earlier last week, the United Nations have stated that Afghanistan could soon be one of the most poverty-ridden countries in the world, and its population would be below the poverty line. So in this regard, Afghanistan issue and the need to have global peace and also to uphold the democratic values in a country would be again in the limelight at the General Assembly 2021. But these power shifts have been so common that it does not exist only in Afghanistan or with regard to Taliban, but also you can see that in Myanmar as well. Myanmar also experienced a power shift that happened in not so in a democratic way. But you might be hoping to see all these new leaders or these Taliban militants at the General Assembly this year. Would that be happening, or would they be joining on the center table with Joe Biden or with any other national leader? Sorry to wake you up from that dream, but that won't be happening this year. The reason for that is the United Nations have recognized the democratic leaders of these countries and still have not recognized these new rules, as it happened in not so in a democratic way. UN might be recognizing these nations and their representatives in the coming days, coming months, or in the very foreseeable future, but as for now, the previous representatives would still have the right to represent their countries, not the Taliban nor any other non-democratically elected representative of the country. Issue number 2 to look out: the climate change. Of course, climate change has been very obvious in the coming years. You can see global warming happening and the ice sheets melting, polar ice caps melting, glaciers melting, and the sea level has been rising for the past couple of years, and all this has been a concern. But also the economic development, and more accurately the economic downfall, has also been a concern, and it has been more of a concern because of this COVID pandemic. And while the nations were struggling to get their economies back in fit, they have lost the environmental focus. Now that can be good, can it? Of course not. A recent report submitted by the United Nations and its affiliated agencies call for a swift action against the climate change. The report submitted by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change showcased an alarming increase of the general temperature on planet Earth. The temperature increase recorded on this report was of 2.7 degrees of Celsius. It's way ahead of the 1.5 degrees of Celsius, the threshold needed to cripple our biodiversity systems. So this is definitely catastrophic and alarming. Why would this be concerning? Because the polar ice caps could be melting at an unprecedented rate, and we could be seeing wildfires more often, we could be seeing glaciers melting so often, and we could also be seeing sea level rising and moving towards a desalinization point. Now all these, along with other secondary impacts to the environment, would definitely be devastating to all flora and fauna alike. Of course, we have been talking about reverting these back for years now. Kyoto Accords, Paris Accords, but have they worked really? Not until now. So again, in 2021, as this would be our last opportunity, our final chance to make it right before we move into a non-revocable or non-recoverable damage, this is our moment to change it all back. And definitely the United Nations would be focusing on this matter at the General Assembly this year as well, and this year more importantly they would be stressing on this more than any other year, as we are critically moving towards a point of no return. Number 3, the COVID pandemic. Last but not the least, nor the most surprising, our old friend, the COVID pandemic, is still being a headache to all the nations in the world. The United Nations and its affiliated agency, the WHO, World Health Organization, have supervised the global vaccine rollout so far, and they have been doing it smoothly. However, now the more economically developed countries are going for a booster shot or a third shot of 2-dose vaccines, whereas certain countries, you could say poorer countries, are struggling to get their hands on even the very first dose of these vaccines. United Nations and the WHO is not happy with this, and the countries are not only dealing with these health impacts, they are also dealing with economic downturns because of travel restrictions and having to close down their economies. They are falling behind their economic targets. Transnational trade, international trade is also crippled. It has faced certain difficulties, and all the economic systems are not doing very great at the moment, and this would definitely be a very concerning issue and would be a very common, one of the most talked about issues at the General Assembly this year. In conclusion, when the heads of states meet each other today evening at the General Assembly, they would be focusing more on the geopolitical pressures and also on the most obvious COVID pandemic and the related issues such as economic downfalls, social and health system struggles, all these issues, and also on the climate change. So these are the key points or the key topics that you should keep an eye on the United Nations General Assembly this year. So folks, this is what we have for today. Sit tight and hit the subscribe button below, and we will see you again in another episode soon enough.